I'm Kathleen Culhane, President of Non-Traditional Employment for Women, or NEW, and I'm also the board chair of the New York City Employment and Training Coalition. Welcome to Meet the 2021 Candidates for New York City Mayor. This morning, we have the pleasure of sitting down with Maya Wiley for the 6th of our scheduled conversations with the publicly announced candidates. Thank you to the members and partners who have joined us to hear from the candidate. NYCETC supports the workforce development community to ensure that every New Yorker has access to the skills, training, and education needed to thrive in the local economy, and that every business is able to maintain a highly skilled workforce. NYCETC's membership is composed of nearly 180 workforce providers, educational institutions, and labor management organizations that provide job training and employment services to over 500,000 New Yorkers, making us the largest city-based workforce development coalition in the country. Thanks again for being with us this morning. I now hand it over to our CEO, Jose Ortiz, to begin our program.
Thank you, Kathleen. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jose Ortiz Jr., and I'm the CEO of the New York City Employment and Training Coalition. It's great to be here with you this morning. Before we get started, all participants should know that you'll be muted for the duration of this call. Ms. Wiley will be provided an opportunity to talk to us about her candidacy and answer some questions in a fireside format. We'll then open it up for a few questions from several members and partners. Please type in your questions along with your name, title, and organization throughout the conversation using the chat icon located on the bottom panel. If you're called upon to ask your question, we will unmute you so that you may ask your question directly to our candidate today. Please note that while we will try our best to get to as many questions as time will allow, we will not be able to answer all questions. I want to thank Ms. Wiley for her leadership and being here with us this morning. For some background on Ms. Wiley, Maya was born in Syracuse, New York, and spent her childhood in New York City and Washington, D.C. Wiley received her Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology from Dartmouth College and a Juris Doctor from Columbia Law School. She has served in the civilian division of the United States Attorney Office for the Southern District of New York, is a veteran of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, the ACLU, and Open Society Foundation, and was the founder and president of the Center for Social Inclusion. From 2014 to 2016, she served as counsel to Mayor Bill de Blasio, after which she served as chair of the Civilian Complaint Review Board and a co-chair of the School Diversity Task Force. Maya has been a legal analyst for NBC News and MSNBC and is a professor of the New School. In October, Ms. Wiley launched her campaign to run for mayor of New York City in the 2021 mayoral election. Maya, welcome. It's great to see you. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Kathleen. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you. And honestly, thank you for the work you do. It's critically important.
Oh, thanks so much. I want to begin by allowing you to introduce yourself a bit more to our community. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your legal career, and your public work.
Thank you. It's always hard to know how to summarize this, especially when you have a resume that Jose just read. Let me start by saying that fundamentally who I am is a racial justice advocate and have always been. I was born in New York, as you all know, but I grew up in DC because my parents were civil rights activists. My father moved to DC to start the National Welfare Rights Organization, which was really the effort to transition from racial justice into the way that racial justice had to address economic justice. And so I grew up in an activist family, even as a young child. And a lot of my experiences were shaped by living in a Black community that was gentrifying, where my best friend, Charlene, who was my best friend in our neighborhood, segregated Black public school that was overcrowded and underfunded, was also the person I played with in the street who lived around the corner from me, who had a lot of older brothers, 7 of them, and her mother worked at the grocery store down the block from us as a cashier. One day, when I ran out the house to find Charlene, because that's how we did it back then. There were no play dates. You just ran out the house, you ran to the corner, you started chasing people down. And I couldn't find Charlene. I couldn't find any of her brothers, which was really unusual because there were 7 of them. Couldn't find her mom. I couldn't find any of them. And when I went home confused, my mother had to explain to me that the landlord had raised the rent and Charlene's mom couldn't afford to pay it. And I knew that Charlene's mom was always at the grocery store. You know, in that way, little kids understand that mama's working long hours. I knew Charlene's mother was working long hours. And that whole experience as a young child was really my emotional experience with exactly what structural racism is, right? Which is the schools didn't work for us, the economy didn't work for us, housing didn't work for us, and no matter how hard folks in my neighborhood worked, none of those things worked for them. And so Charlene and her family did not live single issue lives. All these issues were connected. And my neighborhood turned over, folks started disappearing left and right. If I was older, I probably would have known the signs of gentrification before Charlene disappeared, but I was a kid. I was a kid who then also saw the other side because we were a middle-class family. Because after my father died, my mother was a professional and actually made her money and was able to help 2 little kids survive the tragedy of watching their father die because she got government contracts as a woman-owned business to do affirmative action programs, including with the police department. And I heard all the stories about the stresses and strains that she underwent, but that's how she put food on the table and that's how she kept the roof over her head. And then later became another kind of small business owner, owning an art gallery. But I say all that because, you know, like all things, our life experiences shape us. And so I was very much shaped by these experiences, including knowing what it was like to have a single mom getting government contracts to keep food on the table, knowing what it was like to live in a gentrifying neighborhood, be in a broken school. And so my career, that summary that you heard from Jose is really the summary of why I went to law school in the first place, because I went knowing that this was a policy construct, that none of these problems were natural and that they were all solvable if we were willing to make different decisions, but we had to fight for those decisions in different ways. I chose litigation because I like to argue. So my mother said, someone will pay you for that. So I went to law school. When I was at the ACLU, I worked on education issues and fair funding for public schools, something I was personally connected to. When I worked at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where I went after the ACLU, I worked on access to healthcare. Because for me, all of the work mattered, all of the issues mattered. And the question was the smart starting points. And I went to the US Attorney's Office after the Legal Defense Fund because now Bill Clinton was president, and it was the possibility of bringing the power of government to these issues of rights and justice, to civil rights cases. And I was fortunate to get to work on a case which was the first one to fight NIMBY in White Plains, New York, to say the Americans with Disabilities Act actually did protect in zoning cases when White Plains was trying to keep a drug rehabilitation program out of downtown, when it was being in downtown that was going to help folks get access to the services that the program was going to try to provide. I won't give you all my experiences in work life, but I will say that from there, going to the foundation world, because after being in federal government, I wanted to get back to the work I cared about, and funding multiracial organizing at the intersection of race and gender and poverty were the kinds of programs I was able to work on, including welfare in the context when we were seeing welfare deform, right? Rather than welfare reform. And also criminal justice reform, going to South Africa and helping to rethink, criminal justice after apartheid. But all that gave me a vantage point to do something that I spent 12 years doing, founding the Center for Social Inclusion, which was to name structural racism, call it what it was. Because when I was a little kid or a law student or at the ACLU or all those other places, we didn't have that language for people don't live single issue lives and how you look actually starts dictating what opportunities you have. So we named it, not just me, I mean, it was my mentor, actually, John Powell, who came up with the term, but being part of a small group of powerful organizations that said, we're gonna call it what it is. And we made that our mission statement, and we worked on all the issues, but partnering with communities of color, partnering with local leaders, partnering with national leaders, because the whole idea was, when it is structural, when it is all the issues, then we have to and must partner on the best ways to create and pass policies and do work and implement those policies in ways that fundamentally flip the script, that change the equation, that say we're going to create pathways and not build walls. And that's what we did for 12 years. And so when Bill de Blasio ran for mayor, didn't know him, but I was on mission. I was excited. I voted for him. And when he offered me the opportunity to be the first Black woman to be a counsel to a New York City mayor, I was excited because I knew, one, that the mission really mattered. That the possibility of government, that I could actually not just keep telling government from the outside what I thought it should do, but could actually go in and try to help get it done. And I was, lots that needs to be fixed, as we know, and very hard for government sometimes to work structurally, which we desperately needed to do. But city government is the level that touches everyone's lives. And when I was there, just to name a couple things, I was actually proud to help sanctuary cities legislation, the first to pass in the city, and thanks to the leadership of city council as well. A lot of that was forcing city agencies to get on board with the program. But getting MWB contracts, that was something, the mayor named me a director of a program that didn't exist. There was really no such thing as a women and minority owned business program, although it technically existed on the books. And we were able to get, and I, having had the experience of being a child of one, said, yeah, we got to do better. It puts food on the table for real people. It creates jobs. And we got the spend from 500 million in the first year to 1.6 billion in 1 year. And it was a big, hairy goal. We matched it the second year. So I learned a lot about what happens around procurement in the city, what happens a lot and what we have to change around doing it better. Not an expert, but important. And I was gratified for learning that and being able to get more money out there to our businesses and communities. But showing government that it can do something differently, because I also worked on digital divide issues as an advocate. And I knew that city government could do different. And I was able to show the city that it could find revenue sources, and found them and showed it to the city, and commit those revenue resources to getting every single unit in Queensbridge houses free broadband that the city paid for, public, the floor beneath which no one would fall. Was it perfect? Absolutely not. But it was showing government that it could do something because I got the agencies to partner, found the revenue, pushed the program, hired smart people who knew how to do it, to show city government that we could actually go bigger and harder on public when the private sector wouldn't serve people who desperately needed the service. Now, I did vote with my feet in 2016, but I didn't ever, and I don't burn bridges, because the opportunities to do things in city government were too important. And so I continued to do that by becoming chair, although I was in academia now, not paid city staff, but chair of the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board, where, I'm gratified that I was able to lead the agency to get the Daniel Pantaleo case over to the police department and protect the authority of the civilian prosecutors we had to prosecute Daniel Pantaleo, the killer of Eric Garner, which ultimately is what got him off the force. Also saw lots of things that we need to change, but also doing the school diversity advisory group, co-chairing that, in which we really did something that I believe deeply in, which we showed you can have all the stakeholders at the table, parents and student activists, the unions, teachers, principals, everybody was at the table, academics who focus on school integration and quality education, and that we could actually work in a partnership and in a transparent and principled way. It didn't say, here's what Maya Wiley is going to say we need to recommend. It said, we need to look hard at what's happening. We need to listen to communities And then we have to formulate from that, and we have to be attentive to what we're trying to build and reimagine, not just what we all personally believe. And that was probably one of the most gratifying experiences that I had working on issues related to city government, because it was partnership. So I'm running to be the next mayor of New York City because I believe that this city can and must not just recover us from COVID, but reimagine us in a way that cures what ailed us before COVID ever even hit. And I know we can do that together. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. I'm going to talk a little bit about the recent 8 months and how the world has obviously changed in ways that we hadn't previously foreseen. Since then, since March, the world, including our city, has changed specifically as a result of the health and economic toll of COVID-19, as well as, of course, the recent movement for social and economic justice, i.e. the Black Lives Matter protests. And based on your description before, I can imagine these pieces having inspired your decision to jump into the race. But tell us a little bit more about that impact on your decision.
Honestly, I was very seriously thinking about running before COVID hit. I was, for all the reasons we've just described, because as we all know, I know everybody on this Fireside chat knows that before COVID, we already had too many communities with scary high unemployment rates, right? I mean, while Donald Trump was taking victory laps off of low Black unemployment figures of 5-6%, we know that if you were Black and male and between the ages of 20 and 24, you had a 12% unemployment rate. That was before COVID and before the jump to 25%. So that was already way too high. Black women were not far behind, and we know what's going on in Latino communities. We know about the wage gap. We had police violence before COVID hit. We had far too many people who were homeless, and we know it was a crisis that we should call an eviction crisis, and that the affordability issues, the increases in rents and stagnating wages are problems we've been struggling with in the city for decades. So for me, part of being called in to this race as a non-traditional candidate, as someone who never thought I would run for public office, was that unless we started doing things differently, unless we started having leadership that said, I'm not going to take the path of least resistance, I'm going to beat the path to an inclusive prosperity, because the only thing that matters is our people, not our political alliances, not our political power bases, just our people. That was already something that was calling me in. And so when COVID hit, what COVID did is exactly what we would have predicted in any crisis, whether it was the Great Recession of 2008, whether it was Hurricane Sandy, whether it was September 11th, that these are things that always show us, one, that we need to be more resilient as a whole to the kinds of things that can come up and ravage us as a city, that impact all of us, no question. But that it's always, always, always the same folks that we saw as essential workers during COVID. The folks that were not just showing up in the hospitals and treating people, which was devastating and traumatizing and unbelievably moving and powerful. People were stocking our grocery shelves. People who were delivering our packages every day. I mean, me and my UPS man are like besties now, right? Black man, though, delivering those packages all through COVID. The Postal Service workers. We know who those folks look like. And I think it's in your report. I think it's in Recovery for All, where you talk about the fact that it's not just that 2 to 3 times more people who are Black or Latino died during COVID. It's that it was 88% of people who died in the city. And that was predictable. So really what COVID did for me is say, okay, now I'm going to get real serious about this, about what was already calling to me, about what I was questioning. Because what it shows us is, once again, we have to take the horrors of this crisis and say, we're not just going to recover. We're not. It's not good enough because stuff was broken before COVID hit. We have to recover in a way that makes us more resilient to the future disasters that we will not be able to predict. And we should no longer have a recovery that says we'll be able to predict who's hit hardest, who's in the worst trouble, what they look like, and where they live the next time around. That's what we have to fix. And this crisis calls us to exactly that kind of transformation and gives us the opportunity to think differently and to transform how government thinks and what government does in the context of reimagining after this crisis. And that's why I'm in.
As you know, COVID has obviously been incredibly harsh in terms of its impact on our city specifically. At the height of the job losses that we experienced, over 1.25 million New Yorkers faced unemployment and steep economic insecurity. This included 892,000 private sector and government jobs lost and 330,000 independent contractors who filed for pandemic unemployment assistance. As of October, the city's unemployment rate stood at 14.1%, which decreased from the month of 16%. However, marginalized communities, as you referenced, are facing the highest rates of displacement. And this is compared to statewide unemployment rate of 9.7% and 6.9% nationally. So we are double the national unemployment rate. How do you plan to address the significantly higher toll the pandemic has had on the city's workers and businesses?
You know, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to that. And I think the first is to recognize it's not a one-size-fits-all, but that means several different things. Okay, we know we have a revenue crisis and it's a deep hole. We can't ignore it, right? We can't ignore that it's an average potentially of $8 billion a year over the next 3 to 4 years to 2024, depending on what we do in the interim. I don't think that's necessarily destiny, but that's at least the hole we're looking at. That means it's a revenue crisis that is also creating an expense crisis, a crisis of what we invest in and how. So I would say a couple of things. One is we have to call everyone to the table and look at our assets, because we have tremendous assets in the city, and say, what do you have to put on the table? We're calling you in to put it on the table. For people with resources, that means putting on their resources on the table, putting money on the table, because we need resources to come out of this crisis. It also means recognizing that city government can transform itself and be more effective utilizing the assets that we have. We'll probably come back to some of these because I think you're noting some in Recovery for All, but certainly recognizing where we have fat in government, where we have duplication, where we have the opportunity to be transformative with our resources so that we're creating in more resources that we can deploy effectively to doing just what you're saying, Jose. So one example, capital construction. I don't know why we ever had affordable housing on the table for capital construction. We shouldn't. I think Recovery for All also points to the opportunity to invest in infrastructure in ways that connect our folks directly to jobs, but recognize, because here's part of where the one size does not fit all come in, recognize who we need to create jobs for, who we need to connect with and support in creating the link between where our public spending goes and the job opportunities it creates, and how we connect those communities, those individuals to those opportunities. And that's why we have to be smarter about workforce development. And that's why we have to be more partnered in it. And that's partnered with the private sector around growth opportunities that the private sector sees. You know as well as I do, the sector of our economy where jobs were added during COVID, where people relocated and moved into New York during COVID. And it was in the tech sector. And we also know that the tech sector is also an ecosystem. It's not just tech jobs in the tech sector, but life sciences, right? Health. We have these growth areas, and we're going to continue to be a growth area in these things as a city. So how do we make sure we're having conversations with our private sector as well as our public and nonprofit sector about how we bring all that to the table together and map out an effective strategy that recognizes our strengths, that builds from our assets, and that does it in a way that is leveraging it more smartly. And I see that in your report. It's something we're already talking about also as part of our campaign and as part of our people's assemblies where we're drawing more New Yorkers in to have exactly this kind of conversation.
Yeah, you mentioned the Recovery for All report repeatedly, and we appreciate your obviously looking into that and the recommendations that we provided. And as you know, it was a set of recommendations that were crafted by about 80 leaders in the private and human sectors, and centered on small business and workforce development for displaced workers and marginalized communities. Outside of the pieces that you mentioned, or elaborating further on the ones that you did any of them stand out to you and align with your vision for kind of post-COVID recovery?
I mean, so many. First of all, let me say that. And I really appreciated the report. I thought it was so comprehensive and thoughtful. But I have to say, I just want to I love the principles. And we use different words, but the principles exactly map to what we've been saying as a campaign. So you all say back to normal is not good enough. That's why I'm running, right? That's why I'm running, because we're not going back to the broken of pre-COVID. We're trying to fix what was broken pre-COVID, and COVID broke even more. So I call it recovery with reimagining, but it's the same principle. The other thing you said is, the prioritization of collaboration is core to the way both what my parents modeled for me as activists, as organizers, what my father modeled when he did welfare rights reform, which is he made the women, the Black women who were on welfare, who were welfare recipients, the board of directors of the organization, the leaders, right? Because the point is, if we're not engaging those who are impacted, we're not going to fix it for those who are impacted. Because no matter how well-meaning we are, and I think I'm a very well-meaning person, but I know if I'm not living the life, I can't necessarily know if my strategies to fix it will work. So it has to be folks who understand, who are experts, but also who have the lived experience. So I love that. That's one of the reasons we're doing people's assemblies, also to have people inform our platform. But that way of thinking about blah, blah, I can't speak this morning. Collaboration with impacted communities is critical. And our first People's Assembly was actually on gun violence with folks who were impacted by it directly, and anyone else who wanted to participate in it. And it was actually, it just near and dear to my heart. And I think that's part of what would make government more effective. And then you talk about investment in, a sustainable economy. And I just, this is the point, is this word sustaining is both about climate change, but it is about, we as a city overcome crisis. We do. That's not our problem. I founded the Center for Social Inclusion because of 9/11, because me and one of my best friends, who's also a political scientist, who always worked on participation of low-income communities of color in the political process, we just said, oh my God, $21 billion was going to come into New York City to rebuild us after 9/11. And as many of you know who probably lived it and worked on it, is guess which communities were going to be cut out of the catchment area for that federal funding? Chinatown and the Lower East Side. Not to mention that we had people impacted all over the city by what happened at the site at 9/11. But I just say that because that's part of why we don't recover sustainably, particularly those who are already vulnerable before we have the disaster. So I love that principle. You said many other things, but I'll just point to a few. The idea of a 21st century career development system, I think, says better what we have been saying, and it says it better. But the point is, we have to have a strategic, aligned, partnered way of seeing our opportunities to develop jobs, to grow jobs that are high road jobs, that are jobs with dignity, and to ensure that we're connecting folks to them who need them the most, who live here now, who are at risk of displacement. And that means aligning with the labor. So you said all those things, and it means thinking about how that's not a single issue either, right? That's how city spends its money. It's how, both in terms of infrastructure and in terms of workforce development, but also how government partners, who it partners with, how that connects to the education system. And you called out high schools and higher ed. So I think we have to see CUNY as a critical resource, as a critical asset to that in this city. Public works projects, and then small businesses. I mean, one of the things I'll talk more separately because I don't want to go on and on because I could talk about this forever, but small businesses and the fact that you point that out directly as a way of thinking about inclusive growth and job opportunity, I think is critically important because as we know, it's also immigrant communities of color generally that are the fastest growing entrepreneurs and often the last supported by government programs really effectively, particularly when we saw relief programs in the context of COVID. So all those spoke to me. And I know procurement reform is critically important for human services, critically. I don't pretend to be expert on the procurement on the human services side, but I know that to be an issue and I know it to be a serious problem. And I've heard it from all different kinds of providers. And I know we have to solve it because our not-for-profit sector, by the way, is a job sector.
Correct. Yeah, I appreciate your mention of the lived experience component of crafting a new vision for the city, because it's just incredibly important and it's often left out. On Monday, in partnership with our friends at the Association for Neighborhood Housing and Development and the Regional Plan Association, we announced the creation of the New York City Inclusive Growth Initiative. This is a 2-year initiative with plans to select a steering committee from applicants representative of the diversity of New York City in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, immigration and history status, disability, income status, and thought. And over the next 2 years, it will develop an agenda for inclusive economic growth across New York City that we hope will add good jobs and retain and expand affordable housing and drive the economy forward while reducing the structural inequities that you referenced earlier. Tell us a little bit more about your plans to address the call to make the city more inclusive. It's something that we hear about all the time, and especially have heard since COVID-19 and the recent social movement. And when considering that, consider a few questions. How do you define inclusive growth and the role of community voices in crafting that agenda? What the specific role that workforce development plays in that discussion? Because I think that's obviously pressing and incredibly important to not just our membership, but to the city's growth, the small businesses that you reference, and large businesses, of course, and some of the big challenges facing workers and job seekers today.
Thank you for that question, because it's a really important one. And inclusive growth, I mean, look, I founded the Center for Social Inclusion. It's not just a word to me, it's a vision. And inclusion means, first of all, it means we recognize it's not one size fits all. That to grow inclusively means to look at where we need to have real meaningful outcomes for folks too long left out of the benefits of public policy and public programs, right? Too long who don't see the success metrics, who don't feel the positive impacts, and therefore, we have to look at disparity. It means being honest and about disparity, about where it exists geographically as well as demographically, and then ensuring that we are including folks who represent those experiences. And also recognizing that means, yes, that means demographic, meaning we're going to have, the largest indigenous Native American population in the country in this city. So we don't have good data on that, but we have to find ways of being in connection even with communities that we sometimes aren't even tracking. So race, gender, but geography matters too, because where and how we have opportunities to grow and develop is going to change community to community in terms of the assets of communities, right? And I believe we have to look, I call them communities of concern, meaning I don't like calling them other things because they are communities and they have assets. We need to be concerned about them because despite their assets, we're not seeing them as opportunities. We are too often talking about them as problems rather than seeing them as filled with asset and opportunity. And so, but that we should be concerned that we're in partnership with and reaching and making sure we understand what we can build from. So where does workforce development fit in that? A huge part of our asset base as human services as well is a huge part of our asset base when we are talking about the assets that exist in communities of concern. And so that is, and it, as we talked about before, when we were talking about a 21st century workforce pipeline, that means workforce development as well as our other assets have to be part of the discussion about, in this community or for this demographic, where's our opportunity? So that's, I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that's how I think about it and approach.
No, that's great. Thank you for that. So we're gonna, in a moment, we're gonna open up to questions from our audience. But in addition to the areas that we've already covered, are there other priorities that you want to discuss that you think our folks would want to hear a little bit more about?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't talked a lot about housing. I think we have to see housing as part of our growth opportunity, that our inclusive growth opportunity. We must, as I said, my earliest experience of injustice was around losing my best friend because of housing. And it's a problem that plagues the nation, not just this city. But we, hopefully we'll have more of a federal housing policy, but we have to talk about public housing and keeping it public, but getting it into better repair, but also seeing, as you all point out, I think you referenced this in the point as well, but you certainly talk about the opportunities for us to do rehabilitation, renovation, that also creates job opportunities. And I know that NYCHA residents, and some of the folks I've talked to are very concerned about whether they will actually get the opportunity to participate in jobs that are created as a result of what's happening around NYCHA. And that's a critically important component, but it's also that we need the affordability of housing, right? So we need high road jobs so people can pay the rent or buy homes and be able to build equity. We also need the ability to ensure that as we're doing that, we're creating more affordability for people who are at the very low and extremely low ends of the economic ladder. And look at what that means in terms of our resources. And we have to start thinking geographically as well around public transportation. Because as we said, it's not single issue lives. Nobody lives single issue life. And we know that if you are a low income person in most metropolitan areas, you probably have a 90-minute commute to a job site. So we have to be thinking about housing, where and how we're creating it, who it's affordable for, but also how that links to the job opportunities, pre-apprenticeship programs and apprenticeship programs like NYU does is obviously really important. And then also what are we doing as government, federal, state, and local around the public transportation that also links to people's ability to access work, because it's a regional economy and we need a regional approach to understanding what opportunities we need to ensure people can connect with.
Thank you, Maya. We're going to open it up for questions now from our audience. And our first question is from NYCETC board member, Wayne Ho, who is the president and CEO of the Chinese American Planning Council.
I heard of that guy.
How are you doing, Maya? Thanks for joining us. As you know, the New York City does contract out over $4 billion a year to health and human services providers. And while this administration has made some positive changes to the sector, as you know, we still have a workforce that's highly women of color, immigrants that are underpaid. There continues to be late payments. We continue to struggle with budget cuts and other host of issues. So if you were to become mayor, what would be some of the plans you would have for the human services sector?
I'm so shocked you asked that question, Wayne. Look, it's a really critically important one because we have to understand that the human services sector and the not-for-profit sector as a whole as job creators. And this goes back to city spend and making city spend smart when we think about job opportunity. So one is, yes, we have to do more to reform procurement and contracting so that we do two things. We ensure that we have a shorter process of getting the contract, a cheaper and more streamlined way, because for our providers to seek city contracting, we have to pay faster. You already said that, and figure out the mechanisms for that. We also have to ensure that we're creating more supports for smaller human service providers that are highly local and highly impacted communities, because I am also hearing from many that, and the cure violence model being a good example, where we are talking about it all the time because of violence interruption, experiencing all these that you're describing, but they're also highly local, often fairly small, struggling with contracts year to year. So we have to figure out a way to support, equalizing the ability to apply for and get city contracts so that we're reaching smaller providers as well. So all those are things that I would do. And when we're talking about the budget, one of the things that we need to have an honest conversation about in this city is ways we're going to have to prioritize spend, and we're going to have to make some hard decisions, at least in the short term. So we have to do it in a way that's smart, and it can't just always be on the backs of human services that are going to be a big part of our recovery. So there are going to be some hard conversations about other things that we're going to have to cut, like loaded police departments, so that we have the human services that actually keep us safer and healthier and more prosperous in the long run.
Thank you, Maya. And thank you, Wayne, for your question. Our next question is from David Aguado, who is the Chief Operating Officer at America Works. David? Let's give David a moment.
My apologies. I thought Jose was actually taking over and doing all the technical operation. But good morning, Mrs. Wiley. Really appreciate the time to hear from you directly. I know you are extremely busy. My question is in reference to the federal monies that come through HHS to New York City for people on public assistance, as well as the federal monies that come through the Department of Labor for the one-stops. My question is in reference to, I guess, are you or how aware are you of these monies? And have you given any thought to any changes that you might like to see to the use, with the use of these funds?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and not one I'm expert on. So that would be one where I'd be looking to experts about both where we have opportunity. I think it's critically important for the city right now, not just waiting for the next mayor, frankly, right now, but also it'll be true for the next administration. So when I'm mayor, the conversations with the federal government about what we need, both in terms of subsidy, but also where we need changes in how we have subsidy and what we're able to do with it. One of the recommendations in the Recovery for All report that I think is really important is this notion that where you have opportunities to get folks paid employment, it's part of a training programs, that it is critically important not to then take that money back out of pockets by cutting, benefits packages that people get that help them subsist. I think that's a critically important, kind of part of the proposal and part of the principle. And how we do that is, yes, there's going to be, I'm sure, city policy related to that and opportunities for the city to think that through. But how do we have we have to have those conversations with our congressional delegation and with the federal government about opportunities they have to be more creative to ensure that our public benefit structure, frankly, doesn't harm people for trying to do what we all say we want people to be able to do, which is work and be able to support their families while they do it, including their job trajectory. So I would want to work with you and other experts on exactly what that means and how to do it. And that's part of partnering and collaborating.
Thank you, David. Our next question is from David Calvert, who is the Director of Strategic Partnerships at Youth Action, Youth Build, New York City Collaborative. And David, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hello. So this is David Calvert. I'm with the Youth Build Coalition citywide, and that's youth renovating buildings, getting job training, getting GEDs, task degrees. And my question is, you've been associated with the de Blasio administration, and you've worked here in New York City. And I think that the de Blasio administration has done a lot of great things, actually, if you think about it, but yet it's very unpopular for some reason. So could you just talk about how do you evaluate the performance of the mayor, and what have been some of the things that you've thought were great, what things not, and how would you be able to, and by the way, I think your presentation's been great, but how would you be able to navigate the dynamic of being a New York City mayor and being, sort of in the mix all the time and somehow come out of that with a widespread support in the city?
Thank you for that question. I agree with you that there have been important things that are positive that have come out of the de Blasio administration. I named one in the form of really increasing our contracts spend to MWBEs, but certainly on the broadband front, when we were able to get every unit of Queensbridge houses free broadband, and sanctuary city legislation has been, important in the city, particularly given Donald Trump's administration. UPK and 3K, really important because of the top 3 costs for New Yorkers. Childcare is a top cost, and I think that's an opportunity also to build on, but I think that was extremely important. I think part of the reason why, and I should also say I really appreciate the climate goals and the efforts to lean into green for all, because I'm a big proponent of the concepts of green for all. We have to solve our climate problem, and we have to get our people to work doing it. So what I would say about what I would do differently, and I say this with experience, because as I said, I did vote with my feet in 2016. Part of what we need in leadership is clear, explicit, transparent principles that are shared and against which decisions are made, so that the partnerships are principled themselves. In other words, laying out clearly, we will make decisions on development based on whether it is going to benefit us in terms of jobs and housing and who it benefits and how it impacts the community, and making sure that there are community benefits in the development. And if it meets those principles, and if we're able to pull folks to the table in order to stress test whether or not it meets those principles, then we make the decision. We can be clear about why. Some people won't like it, some people will, but it makes a huge difference for people to know and understand what decisions are being made and why, and whether they're meeting and being consistent with principles. If you just look at the men at the Lucerne on the Upper West Side right now, this is a clear example of where this administration just gets it wrong needlessly. Because the principle, public health, and that our people who are suffering and at most at risk, that need services and supports and housing to stay healthy, that's what utilizing empty space in a shuttered hotel represented. And what have we learned from that? We have learned that when you align the human services with the needs of the population that you put in that housing, you start to both make sure that the community knows it's safe, but you also make sure that the residents are actually doing better, not just safe from COVID, but doing better. And in both in terms of whether it's managing drug addiction, we've learned in that the single room occupancy of the Lucerne has produced lower recidivist substance abuse rates because they had a private room. So my point is, you don't just say we're going to toss them and move them because we got a complaint when we have a thing that meets all the principles. And it just requires real talk. It requires real conversation. It did require also including the community around the Lucerne, but residents of that community circled the wagons, created the relationships, built community, figured out how they could provide supports, and it's working. It should be seen as a model, not something where we're caving because there's somebody who can file a lawsuit. And that's the kind of thing that drives folks crazy. That's just about leadership. And the most important thing that I will do, and the first thing, is restore trust in government. And that really does mean clarity around principle, transparency, and inclusion in process. And then in making the decision, being able to be very clear about how it meets the principles, how it engaged people, that everyone was heard, that it was stress tested, and here's why it's happening. And it doesn't mean there'll ever be 100% agreement in this city, but it can restore our ability to be one city that's rising together.
Thank you, David, for your question. Our next question is from Angie Kamath. Angie is the University Dean of Continuing Education and Workforce Programs at the City University of New York, or CUNY. Angie, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. There is a homeschooler here, sorry. Good morning, Maya, and thank you so much for your comments. I appreciated what you said about being able to utilize all the assets of the city. And so my question for you is, I'd love to hear more about your vision for how CUNY could be a central part of not only the city's recovery, but really a thriving New York City, and how we could use all of the CUNY assets, our community colleges, our senior colleges, our faculty, our graduate programs. We have nationally recognized leaders, researchers, programs at every level, and would love to hear just some more thinking on what that might look like. I find that often the conversation on CUNY kind of starts and stops at the community colleges, which are so very important, but they're not the entirety of CUNY that serves, over 500,000 New Yorkers each year.
Yeah, well, absolutely, and thank you for your work. Look, I think you already said it, but one is to recognize that CUNY has many things to offer at many levels of higher education. And yes, community colleges are pivotal, particularly for folks who need a stepping stone to a 4-year degree, and where community colleges are an important opportunity for that. And we know all the statistics about even 2 years of higher education and the impact that it has on people's earning opportunities. But to your point, and look, my brother got his master's degree at Hunter. And I think the point is that as resources, we both have expertise. And we also have, when we think about this jobs pipeline and job growth opportunity, it's both higher ed is an area of growth opportunity for the city as higher ed. And CUNY is a critical part of that higher ed ecosystem for the city. When we think about things like, one of the conversations I've been having with folks about the opportunities to grow more in life sciences. And so thinking about how CUNY is a critical partner in that. The other kind of thing that we have to think about is, as we're having all these complicated conversations about what inclusive growth looks like, that does mean looking at where do we have the research and intellectual support and expertise that exists in CUNY for these kinds of ideas, but also where and how are we seeing the opportunity pipelines of higher level and advanced degrees for folks in terms of the growth opportunities we have in terms of jobs. So I don't pretend that I know all of them. I think this is the reason why we need partnership and why we need conversation and why we need to have a table that recognizes that we have these assets and we have to pull folks in to be able to also identify what city government misses in its opportunity to leverage the asset that is all of CUNY. Because I agree with you, it's a rich asset.
Thanks, Angie. Our next question is from yet our third David, actually, David Condliffe, the Executive Director of the Center for Community Alternatives. David, oh, sorry, actually, we're going with Gary, apologies. Sorry about that. Gary Jenkins. Gary Jenkins, who is the administrator over at the Human Resources Administration. Gary, the floor is yours.
Hi, Maya. How are you? It's great to see you.
It's great to see you, Gary. How have you been?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much. So my question is more related to city government, and just would love to hear your vision on how you would coordinate the city agencies in addressing workforce development. As you know, we have HRA, SBS, and NYCETC, all providing great services to New Yorkers who are in need of workforce development, but just with a better understand how you would, what's your vision to bringing us all together to work as a collaborative opposed to in silos?
Yeah, well, the approach I have would be to ask government to partner with itself. You know, to your point, Gary, and we all know this, government can be very fragmented. And one of the things that has to happen in government is we have to partner better with ourselves. You know, and I saw this firsthand when I was in City Hall, and you know, I helped create the Gender Equity Commission, and then City Council was doing the Young Women's Initiative, and so I ended up saying, you know, there's this whole, let's actually get city government agencies together to talk about what each agency is doing for young women and girls, and what we think city government can do better to serve more, particularly young women and girls of color. And you know, that included HRA and ACS and DYCD. And the point of DOE, I think we brought at least 10 agencies together. And what was so clear so quickly is that we have agencies doing really interesting things, and one agency didn't even know what the other was doing. Just even the basic information. And we started to identify that there were pipeline gaps that didn't have to be pipeline gaps, where one agency like ACS had programs that went from A to B, and then kids dropped off unless they could find for themselves where they could go from B to C that existed in programs from another agency. Now, I left before we figured out how to fix that, but even just having a table where the city agencies come together on a regular basis to look at what the workforce development programs are, who they serve, what is not getting served, where does the city government have gaps that we shouldn't have, and where is there the opportunity to create a seamless system of services? Because it shouldn't be that not-for-profits or residents themselves have to be able to navigate a labyrinth and figure out how to get to the center of it. That we just have to do better. So I don't know all the answers. Once again, I do know that leadership that calls us to the table, and I would include having that conversation outside of government, because I think human service providers, workforce development providers also see the gaps that government itself may not see or identify for itself, or see opportunities to leverage what is happening across different programs of city government to do it differently. So a lot of it is by creating the opportunity for collaboration and recognize that it has to be supported, and it's City Hall that has to support it.
Thanks, Maya, and thanks, Gary. Our next question is from David, who's now on the screen. David, I'll let you take it from here.
Many nonprofits like CCA, Fortune, and Osborne favor borough-based jails with space for workforce development and other programs. Do you favor borough-based jails? And if so, how will you counter the fear-mongering that the PBA has launched on bail reform and that the Corrections Union and others have already launched around borough-based jails?
Yeah. Well, you know, ideally, I prefer no jails at all, but our goal is to get to the point where what we do is borough-based. So I absolutely support the borough-based model, that it should be about rehabilitation, not punishment. That means that we need to be looking at how we know that we reduce recidivism when we take care of people, when we ensure that they have a way of coming out of the criminal justice system able to re-enter with stable housing and with a real job opportunity or an entrepreneurship opportunity. And that one of the big failings of our criminal justice system has been things like education and programming. And I know as a state, New York State has been, and I know this from folks who do programming in other parts of the country, we are one of the hardest systems for providers to access in terms of to deliver programs. And so it's a real opportunity. And the important thing about this closed Rikers model is this opportunity to both, you know, change how we're doing jailing in the first place, but doing it in a way that actually supports the success of people. So I am a big proponent of it. And I'm going to go back to what I said earlier about running because I'm not captured by any power interests. The PBA has power because it utilizes its ability to drive fear. And so a key part of fighting that, one, is ensuring that we're countering that, not giving into it. You know, it was even the New York Post. The New York Post put out data that said, the New York Post. Did I say that? All right, I just want us to pause on this. The New York Post said that Commissioner Shea's own data did not support the argument that violence was increasing because of bail reform. The New York Post, the city should have been putting that data out and being very explicit and very transparent and very honest, including, and sometimes if the data shows that there is a problem, we have to be honest about that. But the city has to be transparent, and it has to make sure that all its agencies are, so that we're having a fact-based conversation and a principled one. And the principles include that it has to be fact-based and that fear can't drive decision-making. And that folks have an opportunity to say what they're afraid of. I don't mean, you know, communities do have fear. And I talk to communities that are experiencing the rates and increase in gun violence. But, you know, even they are calling for, and the ones impacted are saying, no, we don't want our kids just being jailed without any programming. We want better educational systems. We think it should be easier to get a job than a gun. And just throwing more police on the corner don't help us. And just, you know, so it's, the conversations actually happening in community is more sophisticated, and government's job has to be to enable the voices of impacted people to be heard while it is being more factual and fair and honest and principled in what it is putting out around the conversation, rather than being captured by the fear that our politics sometimes create.
Thank you for the question, David. Our next question is from Cinda Lawrence, who's an executive associate at the Boys Club in New York, which I'm so happy to see ask a question. It's an organization that I grew up going to, actually, in Jefferson, in East Harlem. So Cinda, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Maya. Stephen Tosh, the executive director, I work for him, and he's going to watch later. He wanted to send his best. And my question, our members and their families are struggling so much in East Harlem, Lower East Side, our clubhouses in Flushing, and everybody, because of the pandemic, of course, so many people, homelessness has become a real issue for so many people. I mean, it was such a massive, complex crisis before, and now it's just, I mean, and homeless people don't vote. And I've been in New York almost 30 years, and I just, it's such a complex, interconnected problem, like you say, is what, as a mayor, what specific kinds of short-term and long-term strategies would you have to try and tackle the problem of homelessness and get these people off the street, because they don't have a voice in the way that other people do, you know, and communities of color are so affected by this, but they don't have a voice. They don't vote. They're just not, they are a community in their way, and they don't get to do that. So what would you do that would be different in tackling the problem of homelessness?
Well, thank you. And I have been so grateful for the education I've gotten on homelessness, including directly by the Men of the Lucerne. What I would say is two things. Someone asked earlier, and I'm sorry, I can't remember who, you know, what I would do differently from the de Blasio administration. And one is, I would not have a housing policy divorced from a homelessness policy, right? That the housing policy and affordable housing policy has to include and be part and parcel of an ending homelessness strategy. For street homelessness in particular, because as we know, the vast majority of people who are homeless are also families who are not living on the streets and who are suffering greatly. And for street homelessness, recognizing that it's a combination of an affordable housing crisis and a service crisis, right? The human services that help folks stay in housing and be able to manage mental illness and or drug addiction, right? Sometimes it's both, sometimes it's one or the other. And that means the city being a better partner. And I've actually been talking to homelessness experts and advocates and service providers about this very thing. So subsidy structure. So figuring out how to transform our subsidy structure, and this may require also state and federal government, so that we are moving people more directly into permanent housing with the supports and services necessary to help support their ability to stay in the housing, is a way in which we can potentially solve street homelessness. Because as we know, congregate shelters are a big reason why folks are making what may not be an irrational decision to be on the street rather than in a congregate shelter. So I think the city has been, obviously making some moves in the right direction on some of these things, but the opportunity to transform what we're doing with the resources we have right now, and using this crisis, because a public health crisis is a perfect opportunity to say to all our governmental partners outside of city government itself, where we need their approval, look, from a public health standpoint, no more congregate shelters aren't the way. And we also know from a human services standpoint that we can be more effective with folks if we figure out how to get folks more into direct supportive housing and start to do that. And we should use the vacancy crisis, right, that we have, shuttered hotels, as a strategy for using our resources to create more of that housing immediately. If I were in city government, I'd be doing this right now. And I certainly will continue to move into that as mayor, into that opportunity to take the crisis that has created vacancy into an opportunity for permanent affordable housing. And again, in partnership with the providers that recognize outreach to folks who are on the street and the organizing of service provision in ways that we know to be effective, like making sure we have population that are maybe housed and co-located in a way that they can have services directly in housing or near where they live, or in ways that are already demonstrated and proven to be effective ways of delivering those services that help them stay in housing and help them be able to live full and productive lives safely and with dignity. That's what I would say.
Thank you, Cinda, for your question. These are our last two questions, the first of which is coming from Chai Jinsarat, who is the policy director at Nonprofit New York. Hey, Chai.
Hi, Joey. Okay, thanks. Hi, good morning, Ms. Wiley. Thank you so much. So as Jose said, my name is Chai, he, him pronouns. I'm the policy director at Nonprofit New York. And my question is related to how you would meaningfully engage nonprofits, and particularly BIPOC-led and grassroots, hyperlocal organizations, as you mentioned, in the policymaking process. I think that what we've seen is from different levels of government, sometimes the efforts to engage this sector are either inaccessible, particularly for those types of organizations. They don't have access to, powerful tables, if you will. And then other times the efforts from the government, both at the city and state level, seem more symbolic. So for example, there's on the state level, a nonprofit liaison, but that position really doesn't have a lot of power, and it doesn't actually grant us access to the governor. And there have been similar, initiatives on the city level that I think our sector is just looking for for a different kind of approach to engagement with the new administration.
Yeah. So thank you for that question. I think it starts with asking the question, meaning. So let me give you an example. When we had our People's Assembly on Monday on gun violence, we ensured that we had a hyperlocal, we invited and had hyperlocal community-based organizations engaged in interrupting violence. And in that conversation, then several issues that I'd also heard by meeting with them individually came up around how city government's working, how contracting and procurement works, what they need to better be able to be effective and be supported to have more impact on what was happening in policy. So the first is to ask the question. And when if we're coming to communities of concern with an asset framework, the first thing you do is say, what are the assets of the community? Which means you're identifying those hyperlocal programs, right? Those hyperlocal leaders, providers, and calling folks to a conversation to say, you're an asset. How do we build upon what you're able to do? And that's where some of the challenges come up, where city government has to fix things, some of the partnering opportunities. So having a focus on communities of concern is one way to do that. And another way, which has to happen when we have any conversation about things like procurement reform, has to ensure that it's inclusive, that it doesn't just include likely suspects. And the government actually has mechanisms for this at the city level. So the community affairs unit actually is quite good at knowing who exists. The city partnering better with itself is about it not just utilizing the community affairs unit essentially just for kind of narrow, consistent constituent services, but really tapping it to say, bring us the assets, make sure we're including the folks you know of that are in Mott Haven or in the North Shore of Staten Island, or, the places we know where we miss people and we miss things, because we do know where we do that. We do. And being engaged with the coalitions, because that's also a way of ensuring that we know who we don't know. So asking the question is always the starting point, and making sure that the question gets asked in a way that helps us identify and pull more people to the table and draws on all the assets of city government, like the CAU, to do just that.
Hi, Maya. My name is Annie. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Special Initiatives here at the Coalition. Thank you so much for your time today and your wonderful and thoughtful answers. So the last question is actually on behalf of someone else who's having a bit of technical issues. This question comes from Kristana Duran, who is the New York State Director of Democrats for Education Reform. So she asks that you mentioned taking more advantage of city spending to provide job opportunities for New Yorkers, obviously something we care a lot about. Her understanding is that state law prevents this. So what steps would you take to ensure that city contractors will be required to hire low-income individuals in New York?
So, this is something, sorry, I just want to make sure I understand the question. So the question is about local hiring specifically.
Yes.
Yeah. So here is the thing. We have to be creative, because I won't go into the legal details, but it's not just a state issue. There's also a constitutional issue about how localities can do local hire, because there's a constitutional principle, and the Supreme Court has said this: you can't discriminate against people from other states in job opportunities, right? So I just want to be very explicit about that, because whatever we do must be lawful. We can't change Supreme Court precedent. There's a difference between regulatory, where you can go to a state and say you need to change this regulation or you need to change this law, versus when the Supreme Court, which we have absolutely no control over, has made a pronouncement. So part of partnering and part of creating a table is to actually be really frank and honest about what the challenges are that we don't control as a city, and finding the creative pathways to achieve the outcomes we want to achieve. And it's part of why partnership is so important, because I do believe it is possible for us to do much better by our people, and particularly our people who are left out. And I also think that part of why government sometimes fails, despite really having the best intentions, is because it swirls within itself rather than creates a creative, innovative space that draws on our experts at CUNY, our experts in the field, our experts at community level, because sometimes it's our local folks who are impacted who said, it's not that complicated. If you just did this, more of us would get that. And so sometimes we make it really complicated and really regulatory, when there are actually some avenues that can actually produce a lot of good for a lot of people. So I don't have all the answers, and I will never be a person, I will never be a mayor that tells you I do. but I will always be one that says there's a way, and we will call each other together to figure that way out. And that's the commitment I can make to you.
Thank you, Maya, and thank you for your thoughtful responses to all of our questions today. You've heard about the critical issues in our community and across the workforce development sector. I'd like to give you a few minutes to make a closing statement if you have any additional remarks.
Well, I want to thank you all, not just for your incredibly important questions, because I found them exciting and important. And a primary reason why I'm running is that these questions have answers. Even if I don't have all of them, I deeply believe and know they have answers. Because every time we've ever done anything innovative, whether it's at the city level or the national level, or it is because we recognize that it is possible. Because the problems were constructed. They are not natural. They were constructed, which means they can be deconstructed. So for me, it's thank you for enabling me the privilege of this conversation for so much time, but also for your work, because without it, government can't be better. And with it, we can all do more for our people. So thank you.
Thank you, Maya. That concludes the 6th of our conversations with the 2021 candidates for New York City Mayor. A quick program note, please join us in January for the 7th of our Meet the 2021 Candidates for New York City Mayor, when we'll be speaking with Kathleen Garcia. Stay tuned for announcements of additional candidates in the coming weeks. Thank you all again for joining us this morning for this really incredible discussion. And of course, I want to once again thank you, Maya, for being here with us and wish you a great amount of luck with your candidacy. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you, and be safe and well.
You as well. Thank you.